Hey, I hope you're doing well. So today is finally the time for a long overdue video in which I will explain my settings for street photography and photography as a whole, because I use them in pretty much all scenarios. I have quickly mentioned them in previous videos, but only bits and parts here and there. So today I will focus exclusively on that. I will go through the settings one by one and start with the most important to me. And at the end I will also mention some special cases where other settings could be a bit more appropriate. So the first and most important setting to me is the shooting mode, and in that regard, no, I don't shoot manual, I shoot aperture priority. So to be straight to the point, aperture priority is a semi-automatic mode in which you manually set your aperture, and then the camera sets automatically the ISO and the shutter speed values. First, this gives you full control over the most important setting in photography to me, which is the aperture. So for the ones who are not yet very familiar to that, aperture is the setting that will define your depth of field in your final image. The lowest number available on your lens will give you the smallest depth of field and gives you this blur, this bokeh effect around the subject. And on the other hand, if you go for higher values, most things in your final image will be tack sharp regardless of where you stand compared to them. This to me makes the biggest difference from one image to another, and that's why I want to have full control on it. Second, as it is a semi-automatic mode in opposition to the full manual mode, it is easier and way faster to use. Once you understand it and get familiar with it, you can almost have all the benefits from the manual mode combined with a very fast and efficient usability. Thanks to that, you will have more headspace to focus on what's going on around you and what may be interesting to shoot. You won't be always messing with your settings while the decisive moments go by without you being able to photograph them. I think I got my point why aperture priority is a good shooting mode to use, but now let's just check some parameters you have to set to actually use it correctly. As quickly mentioned before, the camera will automatically set the shutter speed and the ISO, but you can still have a little bit of control and tell your camera in which range you want these two to fluctuate. In real terms, you can tell your camera not to go below a certain shutter speed and not to go above a certain ISO. This will depend on the camera you're using, but most recent cameras can go up to 6400 ISO and still get usable images. Actually, both with my Sony a7iv and my Ricoh GR3, I set the maximum ISO at 6400. Then it's time to set the minimum shutter speed you want, and for this we have to take into account the lens you're using. The longer the lens, the faster the minimum shutter speed should be. There is a general rule saying that your minimum shutter speed should be double the focal length you're using. So in real terms, it means that if you're using with a 50mm, your minimum shutter speed should be 1/100 seconds. I think this is pretty accurate, but it depends on your shooting style. I know that I like to shoot in motion and be really quick to react, so I would go a little bit faster than what's recommended by this rule. So for example, with my 85mm, I would go up to 1/250. And that's it, your aperture priority mode is set, and I will come back later for some special cases, but generally it's how I use it for more than 95% of the time. I think we are done with the shooting mode, and now let's move on to the focus mode and the focus area. So as myself, I like to shoot in motion, and most of the time my subject in the context of street photography are also in motion. It's quite logical that I use the focus mode continuous. Recent mirrorless cameras have a really good autofocus, and it would be a shame not to use it to its full potential, I think. As for the focus area, I like to use the tracking mode combined with the spot, either the medium or small size, or the extended spot. So when the shutter button is pressed halfway down, your camera will start focusing on the subject and track it, which makes it really useful when you have your composition and your subject is finally coming in the frame. You can take a whole series of pictures while having your subject in focus the whole time. The other scenario I find the tracking really useful is, for example, when I don't have time to move my spot in the frame, I can just do the good old focus and recompose method. So that's it, your focus mode and focus area are set, and I hope you'll get back from your photo session with almost all your pictures in focus. And now let's move on to the white balance. So this section will be very quick, I'll get straight to the point. I use automatic white balance. Why? Because I shoot RAW, and basically I have all the freedom in post-production to change my white balance, so I don't bother trying to set a proper white balance while shooting, because I know that I'm typically the person who will set the white balance to maybe sunlight, and once I get inside the building I would always forget to change my white balance, so I'll keep it in automatic. So let's talk about the metering mode, and the metering is something that is not extremely reliable in all conditions, so I would recommend to judge from what you can see on the screen or in the viewfinder. Your camera is just coming up with a theoretical perfect exposure for what you're shooting at, but in a lot of cases the perfect exposure doesn't match the artistic intention for that particular shot. To speak in more real terms, I use the multi-metering mode, which measures the lights and set a proper exposure for the entire frame. Based on this, I use the exposure compensation and set it at -0.3 as a base. The reason for that is that recent cameras are really good at keeping the details in the shadows, but not so good at keeping the details in the highlights. Therefore, it's better to underexpose and recover your shadows in post than the other way around. So from there, it depends on the conditions and what I want to shoot. If I am in a very contrasty environment and I absolutely want to keep my highlights, I would go even below this 0.3 and just use the exposure compensation dial and judge from what I can see on the viewfinder or on the screen. Now let's finish up this video talking about some special cases where those settings may not be entirely appropriate. First one is motion blur. So obviously with the minimum shutter speed we set in the aperture priority mode, it would be impossible to create some motion blur or doing some long exposure. I only take such shots in very rare occasions, but when I do, I just change the mode and choose the shutter priority mode, which basically works the same way as the aperture priority mode, but the only settings you have full control on is the shutter speed. And then, depending on the desired result and your gear limitation, tripod, no tripod, you can set your shutter speed and get the shot. Another scenario where my basic settings would not fit properly is nighttime photography. So because of the reduced light, keeping the minimum shutter speed, as I previously mentioned, would be almost impossible. Therefore, I reduced it to the lowest, where I'm still comfortable to shoot handheld, maybe around 1/50, 1/30, and then I adapt my shooting approach. I definitely cannot be as much in motion as I am when shooting in daytime. Second thing to mention is that the metering is even less reliable than in daytime, so that's why when shooting at night I really use the exposure dial compensation and make decisions based on what I see on my viewfinder or on the screen. It's pretty common for me to go down to -2 or even less if that makes sense, and match what I want to get as the final result. Okay, I think we covered all the points I wanted to address in this video talking about my photography settings. I really hope this may be useful for you, and I look forward to read any of your feedback, questions in the comment section. With that said, I end the video here, and I look forward to see you around in the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye.